I'll just introduce myself. My name is Sinu Pida. I work as the Principal Security Architect for CyberProof. And with me today, I have Sean, the North American Technical Director for Skybox Security, our partners in our vulnerability management service that we provide. And I want to thank you all for taking your time. And what I'm going to try to do in the next 40 minutes is have a dialogue with Sean and look at how the SOC can use vulnerabilities that matter and get that visibility that they require. So things around key questions to ask that you should be able to answer. Key barriers to effective vulnerability management. We are seeing a lot of barriers coming up, and also how do you enable the SOC? How does that process work? What kind of a process can we adopt in the SOC to sort of move ahead and do things with it? And that's sort of the key messages that we want to bring out today. And of course, please feel free to post your questions in the chat box, and we can come back to them at the end of the session. And if we're not able to get to them, we'll definitely be able to sort of play them back to you using the messaging that we have. So the first step is obviously to look at why these vulnerabilities, I guess, because you sort of need to make sure that, vulnerabilities are still, provide the largest attack surface for a threat actor to infiltrate an organization. Okay, so Verizon's data breach investigations report that 85% of exploited vulnerabilities were more than 2 years old. So it's not always about the criticals. Most exploited vulnerabilities were not really ranked critical. Another thing, through the Gartner and X-Force investigations, we see that these most exploited vulnerabilities were actually, they've been around for years, and they just seem to be exploited by attackers. And if you look at the graph on the sheet, we had a poll with some very large organizations who said, how often do you actually remediate or how often do you remediate vulnerabilities? And they said 90% of the time we remediate the vulnerabilities. But the second question we asked was, approximately how many vulnerabilities do you patch every month? And that they said about 40%. So, people have that misconception that they're actually covering their entire base. And why do security teams find it difficult to understand where their high-risk vulnerabilities are? It's the traditional scanning approaches no longer work. You're not aligned to your threat exposure. There's an increase in complexity, having made it difficult to aggregate all sources of vulnerability data. And often there are parts of the infrastructure that are not really scanned, and you are not able to reach them. And the security teams consider these as blind spots. Also, with the latest kind of way of working, we have a dispersed infrastructure moving into the cloud. We have a dispersed workforce, which makes it more difficult to know what you're trying to protect, where it is, and who's trying to attack you. And, I wanted all of you to look at some of these questions that I've now posted, and we're going to run a poll here to see, a yes or a no to these questions as we go along. So, when an organization is making the decision to increase their vulnerability management capacity, do you really know who is trying to attack you and where these attacks are coming from? So, just tick on the box if you think it's a yes, and if it's a no, leave it unticked. And do you really know where your critical security gaps are? More importantly, look at the other things, like, does your SOC have visibility of the vulnerabilities so that they can sort of tell them there's a mitigation option? Are you really maximizing the capabilities of your own SOC team? Feel free to click on the poll and give me your view so that we know what it is. And I'm not sure if all of you have read the book, The Art of the War. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the results of 100 battles. So it's a typical challenge that we are trying to address. And I'm just going to go back and check the poll results and see how many of you actually have actually answered yes to the questions. And okay, nice. So there's quite a few of you that say that they don't know what their business's attack surface look like, but many of them know what their critical security gaps are. And very less, about 25% actually say that they have no idea how to reduce the vulnerabilities that are being generated. So this is great because this is sort of bringing us context to move on to the next step of how we can define some of these processes and what's actually stopping you from getting there. That's another thing we need to look at. Sean, do you want to sort of give us a view on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. As organizations move forward to addressing some of those issues that you just talked about on the last slide, here's some of the things that are typically holding them back. That first one there, infrastructure. Infrastructure sprawl is just a huge problem that a lot of organizations are dealing with. Right, a couple of years ago, the network that a typical CISO was responsible for was really, a couple of buildings that the company owned, computers and applications that they owned, the network. Everything was inside these buildings and very easy to control. Now it's often just a crazy mess out there, right? Multiple public clouds, business units, spinning up different cloud environments, shadow IT, multiple instances all over the place. SaaS platforms for application makes it difficult to control security on. Maybe some private clouds internally, SDN. And a lot of times organizations have to, the IT portion of organizations, end up taking on responsibility for OT manufacturing kinds of networks or building control systems, and even the whole, bring your own device kind of problem. So the environment that that you're supposed to protect now is just so much more fragmented and difficult to get your arms around these days. So yeah, infrastructure sprawl is huge. Just kind of working down the list there, threat intelligence. Managing vulnerabilities has become very difficult. One of the reasons there is just multiple sources of data. Trying to get context around this is difficult. Threat intelligence, being able to get that feed in and apply that to the vulnerabilities that you have in all those different locations is often a huge challenge, right? The analysts are out there telling us that you need threat intelligence, you need to understand what's happening in the real world, but applying that real world data to your own environment can often be very challenging. Down there at the bottom, expertise, always a, oh, here we go. Let's start my video. There we go. Expertise. We all know that there's a huge shortage of cybersecurity engineers out there. And it's also difficult to keep good people around. So we need to make sure that we have solutions that take advantage of automation, right? We want to make sure that the system is doing those low-hanging fruit kind of problems, that we're automating the things that a system can be good at automating so that the engineers can focus on doing what they need to do, right? We need to be able to focus them on the really important tasks. So expertise, a big problem. Attackers, this is one of those really misunderstood areas, right? You talk to kind of average people in the world and you say, what does a cyber attacker look like? And you still get the answer of, this guy eating cheesy puffs in his mom's basement, trying to hack computers. And that's just not descriptive of the attackers that are really out there today, right? It's it's organized crime, it's nation states, it's very well funded, organized criminals that are doing this for the purpose of making money. So we've got to understand the attackers and just the level of resources that they have to bear to actually make an attack happen. And it really is about money. The old analogy of you don't need to outrun the bear, you just need to outrun your neighbor. Indeed. Is very true here, right? The attackers are going to win. They are going to get into somebody's system. Really, the best you can hope for is that they get into your neighbor's system and not yours. And to do that, You need to understand, what are the vulnerabilities that they're going to use, make sure those are mitigated, make sure that your environment is harder to get into than your neighbor's is. Detect in prevention. This is another interesting kind of facet of this whole problem. Again, analysts for the last couple of years have been telling us, you need to assume that the bad guy is in your network. Focus on detection, focus on incident response, that whole kind of thing. And we've really seen spend on prevention decrease, and a lot of focus, of course, going into the SOC. Then you go and talk to the SOC managers and you find out that they're completely overwhelmed with the number of incidents that they have. They're not able to process all the incidents. So we really need a more balanced approach where prevention and the SOC are working hand in hand. We're doing work on the prevention side to make sure that we're mitigating risk and remediating vulnerabilities that are causing the greatest amount of risk, so that the SOC folks can focus in on the responding to the incidents that really represent the greatest risk, that they're not spinning their wheels chasing things that they shouldn't be. And of course, lastly, down there at the bottom, laws and regulations. There's always something new coming along to divert resources away from incident response and prevention into just figuring out how to be compliant with whatever the new regulation is, right? So there's time that gets spent on this regulation side of things, creating new reports and that kind of thing that adds overhead and doesn't necessarily make you more secure. So it's just kind of one of those things that you have to do, right? You need to be compliant with whatever regulations apply to you. But we need to understand that that's going to draw away from active resources that can be there to reduce risk and respond to that. So yeah, a lot of challenges for the average organization out there.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you, Sean. That's something we're seeing in the SOC as well. And it's most of our customers have the same issues, and we see this. We see them actually this as a large preventative way of, they're not able to adopt some of these processes. And what else have you seen in the market? Like, have you seen other challenges like the sprawl of infrastructure and the complicated client infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. That infrastructure sprawl, right? We just talked about. One of the other real challenges is just the number of systems that the average organization is dealing with.
Okay.
I think the last statistic I saw was 70 or 80 different security tools is what the average enterprise organization is trying to try to manage, right? And you look at some of these products on the screen, and it's crazy, right? To think of trying to get your arms around the data that's coming out of all of these tools. So integration becomes very important, right? Making these different systems talk to each other, talk to central systems, where you can bring these different piles of data together, and they can cease to become different piles of data and become context. When we're able to bring data together, correlate it with each other, then we really start turning data into intelligence, right? We understand how different pieces of data relate to each other, and that really gives us that visibility, that context, that insight into what's going on. And one of the challenges that we see in organizations quite a bit is they see all of these different integrations, or these different products that need to be integrated together. And we see a lot of different integration projects that are out there. And we often get customers to ask themselves, why are you integrating these two things together? What's the end goal? How successful can you be? A great example of this is like the ERP systems, 10 or 20 years ago. On paper, they just looked great, right? They looked like they would solve all the problems. And then when a lot of organizations started implementing them, they were very difficult to finally get that real, the benefit that you could see when you drew it up on the whiteboard. And we saw organizations struggle with that for a long time. We see the same kind of thing in some organizations that are trying to pull together kind of these big monolithic platforms, CMDBs, one of those kind of things, like trying to get all of the business units in an organization to put their data in one single place. One of the big struggles is just the fact that all these little business units and silos often want to keep control of their own data. They want to organize it, they want to control it, and they feel like they're giving that up if it is going to go into some repository that they no longer have control of. So you really need to be able to overcome the human element in a lot of these integrations. As Anne said in the last session, it's not just about technology, right? It's always got to be people and process and technology. And sometimes the solution isn't just technology. You've got to deal with it on the people and process side as well.
Cool. Thanks, Sean.
Yeah.
So Sean, you mentioned about the people. So it's fantastic. I've never seen a CMDB. I've never seen a real CMDB. Okay, so it's always something missing. But you mentioned that the people. So do you want to tell us, like, what are the issues with people?
From a people standpoint, the challenge that we often see is just a huge dysfunction in how different groups of people are talking to each other, right? Different silos. I've been in this industry about 20 years and been working on the vulnerability side of things for a little over 10 years. And when I first started doing this, I would, I'd go into organizations and I would talk to the InfoSec team, the security team, talk to them about their vulnerability scanning programs and hear what they're doing, the scanner they're running, and the prioritization they're using, and see these big reports that they're generating. And they would say, okay, at the end of the process, we kick that over to IT or operations or the server group, something like that. And so then I'd go and I would talk to that group and I'd say, okay, how do you guys roll out patches? What are you doing to remediate vulnerabilities? And they would tell me about their patching and what they're doing. And I'd say, okay, so InfoSec creates this list of vulnerabilities. How does that integrate into your process? And over and over, I kept hearing, it doesn't. They give us that list and it's a crazy list. It's too big. There's a billion vulnerabilities on it. It takes a ton of work for us to translate those vulnerabilities into the patches that we need. So we end up not doing anything with it. We have our own method of rolling out patches. So over and over, we would just see this break between security and operations. Security would be working on prioritizing vulnerabilities, and IT just wouldn't be using any of that data, mostly because the prioritization wasn't good enough. The pile of prioritized vulnerabilities remained too big, not granular enough for ops to really get their arms around. Then there's a whole language thing. Security tends to talk in vulnerabilities and risk and stuff like that. IT is talking about patching and remediation. Sometimes they're focused on just getting a specific fix done instead of necessarily understanding what the root cause is. Integration, just the difference between focusing on finding the problem versus focusing on fixing it. And a lot of times in organizations, we see this this very closed loop of find a vulnerability, roll out a patch, vulnerability patch. And nobody's really stepping back to say, what else can we do, right? For every vulnerability that gets exploited, there's a kill chain, right? There's an attack path that happens. So you need to step back and understand, what those attack vectors are. How does lateral movement come into play? What are some non-patch mitigation options, right? Do I have IPS signatures that I can roll out? How do I cut down lateral movement in my organization? So we really need to get organizations to step back from this very focused patch and vulnerability finding loop. And then lastly, just from a remediation standpoint, again, that limited number of remediation options needs to be opened up. And one of the things that's missing in just these two groups, security and IT operations is the SOC, right? Where does the SOC play in all of this? A lot of times in organizations, when we talk about vulnerabilities, the SOC isn't even included in that, or it's an afterthought. Maybe they get a report or some risk data or something like that. Sometimes the SOC is actually in the middle of this thing, coordinating remediation or correlating vulnerabilities against incidents. But more often than not, we see them kind of sitting on the side and not really being very integrated into this whole loop.
Nice, Sean. That's a good concept, because at CyberProof we're actually trying to be at the center of this, and we're trying to use the SOC to sort of take that prioritization and that intelligence and sort of give them that aggregated single point of view. So
Yeah.
it's like you have the vulnerability exposures, the attack simulations that a SOC can do, the automated purple teams and the manual red teams, and you have this security controls that are in the part of the SOC, and we're able to kind of look at also the exploit kit availabilities, trying to understand from threat intelligence, is this really valid? We have knowledge of the vulnerabilities through their age, their densities. The SOC also seems to be more closer to the business, because we kind of know the business impact of any of these vulnerabilities that might happen. We're able to connect to the CMDB. We're trying to understand the proximity of the vulnerability. And what CyberProof is trying to do is give that threat-centric view for visibility. And it's looking beyond just the CVE, and looking at this large gamut of information that you have to actually give you a threat-centric view to the vulnerability. And when we actually want to apply a process to it that can work for the SOC, we actually look at this in a model that we can expand. So if I just walk through these colors, and bear with me, it's a pretty a colorful diagram, but we are aware that there are vulnerabilities, and the dark gray or the light gray circle outside kind of shows you the entire range of vulnerabilities. You have different processes that can discover these vulnerabilities. You have breach simulations, you have validation, attack surface mapping, detection, intelligence. You have all these different tools and technologies and processes that you follow in your organization to understand that there are all known vulnerabilities across the estate. But then you try to focus on that light blue teal circle there, which is you have some sort of a scanner, it does some sort of a discovery, and you find what are the open vulnerabilities that are part of your organization's estate. CyberProof tries to concentrate on the other three vectors that we need to look at this. So looking at the critical vulnerabilities, so perhaps your scanner already does a sort of a rating system, something like a CVS scoring that will allow you to prioritize the vulnerabilities that you have in an organization. So that's great. So that light pink circle there covers all the critical vulnerabilities that you might be exposed to. And then you look at the second part of it is more about the exploitable vulnerabilities. So things around using your threat intelligence and looking at how things can be exploited. So are there toolkits available in the wild? Are they imminent in the future? And you sort of get that light orange semicircle there. You get the range of assets that are exploitable. Then we also look at the exposed vulnerabilities. And how is this possible? This is made possible by creating an attack surface of your network and your organization, and then understanding what are the exposed vulnerabilities for which an attack vector is available. So check your security controls. You might have manual penetration testing, you might have automated penetration testing. You want to bring in these results, and those will sort of give you the exposed vulnerabilities. So CyberProof as a SOC looks at those critical, exposed, and exploitable vulnerabilities, which gives you a threat-centric view to manage your vulnerabilities. It kind of reduces the amount of vulnerabilities that you need to focus on from an organizational perspective. And we try to map these to a process and a solution that we've developed. And we we classify these into services, although this approach can map to your goals and you can change it based on the maturity of your current process. We kind of look at the discovery and the scanning side of things. So we look at mapping your vulnerabilities from multiple sources beyond CVS's data. You sort of look at intelligence. So you look at how can you prioritize these vulnerabilities based on your organization's attack surface. You need to look at simulations. So for example, simulate breaches to maybe things you cannot scan, for example. Test your control effectiveness. And last but not least is do that risk mitigation, not just patch management, but also control changes. And you kind of tie these four individual processes using a mature operations framework with a solid delivery governance. And historically, there's been a lot of investment in vulnerability scanners, yeah, and people are trying to see how do you leverage these investments when there's a time to move forward. How do you bring together the contextual information and put capability in place that allows you to sort of better control remediation activity. And aggregation of all vulnerability scan data. So it could not only be your infrastructure, but it can be your applications as well. So you want to make sure that you aggregate all of this and then get a prioritized view to the patches and the other mitigation options you have. So this is sort of the way we have broken it down into a solution area. But more importantly, it's you have to understand that you can decide what you can do to sort of get more visibility.
Excellent. We lost you there for a second, I think, or maybe I did. So yeah, the question then is how does the SOC get that visibility, right? What do we need to do to allow the SOC to get this kind of crucial visibility and context into vulnerability prioritization? As you mentioned there on that last slide, so vulnerability aggregation, absolutely one of the key things that organizations need to deal with. Again, we start talking to companies and we find out, on first blush, they'll say, we're using X scanner. It's like, okay, what else are you using? What else is finding vulnerabilities? And you start digging in and you find out that maybe there's another scanner that came in from a business unit or an acquisition or something like that. Maybe they're using Microsoft ADP to find vulnerabilities as well. Maybe web and application scanners, DevOps, is creating vulnerabilities. So when we see organizations start to dig into it, they really start to find that they have vulnerability data coming in from a lot of different sources. Then, of course, you get the OT and IoT stuff in there as well. And so, one of the first things is being able to bring all of that together into the same place and then being able to prioritize. And when we talk about prioritization, context is king around prioritization. So, what do we see SOCs doing to get that better visibility? And one of the ways to do that, and again, Anne kind of touched on this in her talk a little while ago, is that concept of modeling, right? Using data science to model what you have. See the term digital twin out there a little bit as well. So on the diagram here, you can see some different areas of data that most organizations have, right? Infrastructure data, asset data, vulnerability data, threat intelligence data. And again, those all start off as different piles of data. And what we need to do is bring all of that together to where it doesn't become data anymore. It's now intelligence and context, right? We start down there in that lower left-hand corner, infrastructure, right? We need to be able to bring in configuration, routing table data, public and private clouds, even OT networks, and be able to build a model that accurately represents the organization, right? We need to be able to understand how does traffic move between any 2 points in the organization before we're ever going to be able to do any kind of attack simulation or traffic pattern path analysis. We've got to have that model together to understand how the traffic moves. On top of that, we need to bring in asset data. When we begin this process, we typically see those as two separate piles, right? Maybe the company has a network map and maybe they've got CMDBs or asset data somewhere else. The problem is they're not related. The company can't accurately understand the relationship between an asset with a vulnerability and the security control on the network that may or may not be keeping that vulnerability from being exploited. So that data needs to get folded into this model, this functional asset and infrastructure model. So we bring that asset data in. Now we understand that relationship between the assets and the infrastructures. Then we want to enhance that asset data with vulnerability data. Again, multi-source aggregation. So we need to pull that vulnerability data in from all the different sources where the vulnerability data exists, get it into that model. So the model now represents infrastructure, asset, and vulnerability. And then lastly, we need to take that very important threat intelligence data that the analysts are all telling us we need to have and be able to integrate that in with the model as well, right? We need to make sure that intelligence data that we're gathering from the real world is applied to the vulnerabilities that we know about in our own internal environment. So once we pull that kind of model together, then it becomes very obvious how we can apply that to different aspects of security operations, right? We can use that in the compliance side of things. We can use that in the vulnerability management world to apply prioritization to those vulnerabilities to where we really understand what vulnerabilities are causing the greatest risk in our environment. And then, of course, integrating all of that in together with the SOC. So that you have actionable results that you can do. So that's how the SOC gets that visibility.
Thanks, Sean. I also wanted to add how CyberProof uses this this modeling. I mean, we run SOCs around the world, and we call our SOCs the CyberProof Defense Center, and that's why the picture shows CyberProof Defense Center. And what we do with this information is pretty cool, actually. So we actually enrich the asset data that we look at during an investigation. For example, we run virtual attack scenarios on your asset model that you've created for us, and we also able to then use that intelligence to prioritize what needs to be taken care of. And more importantly, CyberProof uses automation and orchestration to drive some of these, especially the alert enrichment and things. So yeah, it's something that we definitely work on in the SOC, and we use in the SOC to give you that visibility and increase our effectiveness at using this sort of a model of aggregating all your vulnerabilities. And Sean, we've talked about this conceptually, but how does this look like in practice?
Yeah. Can you advance to that next slide for me? I'm sorry.
I can. Yes.
Thanks. Yeah. So this is a case study from one of our customers. So this is a very typical kind of environment. If you start there in the upper left-hand corner, when we first started working with the customer, they were reporting about 1.5 million vulnerabilities from their vulnerability scanner. So pretty good sized company. And the scanner was then slicing those into severity, right? That's typically the first cut we see for prioritization. And we often see that the critical and high severity vulnerabilities represent somewhere between 25 and 30% of an average vulnerability pile. And so you go back, 4 or 5 years ago, and this was really it. This was the extent of prioritization for most organizations. And it's the thing that made vulnerability management so difficult is you really couldn't get resolution past this kind of 25 to 30%. A couple of years ago, we started to see vulnerability scanners adding exploitability data to this, right? So we started to understand, what are the pieces of malware that are out there? How do those link to vulnerabilities? Which vulnerabilities have been actually exploited in the wild? Which ones have maybe had a vulnerability or a exploit shown, but maybe just in a lab or a very contrived environment, right? So we need to understand what's actually out there. How likely is it that this vulnerability will actually be exploited given what's happening in the real world? But even at that level, that often gets us down to the 9 to 12% range. And this example is down to about 11%. But even at 10%, right, that sounds like a huge reduction, right? We've gone from kind of this big pile down to 10%. But when you talk about starting with big numbers like 1.5 million, 10% is still 150,000 vulnerabilities. It's just too big, right? You can't sit down with your remediation team at a conference table with a big stack of papers and go, all right, here's 150,000 vulnerabilities. Let's go get these today, right? So you've got to be able to go beyond that. You've got to get past just severity and exploitability. And there on the right side are some of the other things that we take into consideration. Right, we need to understand the assets, and this is this is always one of those really fun subjects and very challenging. Often when I sit down with organizations and talk through this and say, okay, tell me about your asset classification program. Right, everybody starts to get really interested in their cell phone and their shoes and stuff. Right, these vulnerability the asset classification projects, they're so important, right? The SANS critical list says you've got to know your assets, you've got to know your applications. And so really understanding what are your assets, how important are they to the organization, which ones contain key data, contain mission critical applications. Organizations have to be able to pull that together. And oftentimes they need help with that, right? They need some intelligence. They need systems that can help classify assets together and help them come up with what are the important ones and how do we rate the assets? How many levels do we want to use? What do we want to call those levels? That kind of thing. So that's something that we can help with. And then the last thing is exposure. So exposure is really understanding that relationship I talked about earlier between the asset with the vulnerability and the infrastructure that has security controls on it that may or may not be protecting that asset from being exploited. If you think about it, as a company, as an organization, you go out and you buy a firewall, you buy an IPS, because your hope is that buying those devices will keep your assets with vulnerabilities from being exploited. Yet often when we go to roll out patches, we do so without understanding which of those vulnerabilities are already being shielded by some of those security controls and which ones aren't. So understanding that through attack simulation, through modeling, and really being able to focus in on vulnerabilities that aren't being protected by those security controls first is just so key. And then lastly, if you take all of that data together, right, you put those four elements together, you get that little teeny piece in the middle, which is often much less than 1%, often a tenth or less of a percent. So we're really talking about a very small number of very high-risk vulnerabilities. These are typically your perfect storm vulnerabilities, right? So they're a vulnerability that, if exploited, would cause a lot of damage, right? High CVSS score. They're a vulnerability that's on an important asset, so that damage would be really bad to the organization. There's an exploit available for this vulnerability, so it's likely that it could be exploited, and it's exposed to a likely threat origin given your own security controls, right? So that is a perfect storm vulnerability. And that kind of data needs to go to the SOC, right? Somebody in the SOC needs to understand we've got important asset that's at risk. It's got all these factors on it, and we need to look at that oftentimes first off from just a, do we still own this asset, right? Let's look for indicators of compromise on this thing. Let's make sure it's still under our control. Then maybe let's understand what the lateral movement is. If somebody was able to take control of this or did take control of it, where can they get in the organization from this? Are there crown jewel kind of assets that can be accessed laterally from this particular asset? So all of this kind of prioritization goes into fixing that dysfunction problem that we talked about earlier. If you can go to the next slide for me there. Yeah, so earlier we were talking about the problem between InfoSec and the operations team, and just how oftentimes there's just not great communication there, and that the SOC is often left out of this. So when we overcome these challenges, we get this kind of data to the SOC, we see that that dysfunction goes away. And this is one of the areas that CISOs often get really excited about, is breaking down silos, helping security and operations work together better, helping the SOC get integrated in with both of those teams. Specifically, what we're talking about is typically helping the communication between the security team and operations from a language standpoint, right? Instead of speaking in terms of just risk and vulnerability from the security team, we want to translate that into the data that operations wants to hear it in, which is patches, right? What patches are going to give us the biggest bang for our buck? And then beyond that, right, what are the non-mitigation or the non-patch mitigation options that we can use? Understanding the attack path and the IPS signatures, right? That kind of data needs to go down to the SOC, right? They need to understand not only here's the crucial vulnerabilities, here's the crucial assets with vulnerabilities, but also here's assets that we can't patch for one reason or another. Let's get those on a watch list. Let's do some modeling to understand what kind of risk we're accepting by not patching those vulnerabilities. So once we do this right, once we get vulnerability management done correctly, we get these three teams talking together, and we really really begin to start to move the needle on risk reduction through vulnerability management.
Yeah, that makes sense, Sean. I mean, it's something that I think is very useful as well, because this kind of joins IT and security together and sort of looks at the comprehensive model of trying to remediate some of this based on the options that they can choose. And I think this brings a big advantage to it. And I just wanted to sort of, sorry, it's too quick. So, sorry, I just want to kind of bring together that, how should you be approaching vulnerability management in a way that enables the SOC to prioritize and remediate these threats. It's looking at that attack surface mapping, visualize your attack surface and infrastructures to detect the exposed and exploitable vulnerabilities by understanding the most likely attack scenarios. Try to combine your threat intelligence with your vulnerability management. Enrich your vulnerability information with context. You might be having your threat feeds, your asset repositories, your security controls, your vulnerability security weaknesses that Try to use a scanless platform that can, aggregate, normalize, and analyze data from networking and operational technologies to give you that visibility of that external threat landscape. Look at the availability of the latest exploit kits, what's being actively exploited in the wild. Given that the threat landscape is dynamic, this view continuously changes, so it needs to be refreshed, and you need to have the window of opportunity to the distributed forms of attack. Breach simulations, so continuously test and validate your infrastructure for control effectiveness and multiple exploits. You need to look at defining your risk treatment and prioritization investments. You need to implement some sort of a platform that can help you with this vulnerability prioritization to provide you a real-time feed of prioritized vulnerabilities, with something that can assist your remediation and validation. So, you need to find the right balance between automation and human input to guide these remediation efforts. You want to make sure that these processes are streamlined, the response time is reduced, and the risk posture is communicated effectively to the right people. And most importantly, don't forget about the context of the business, because you need to have that well-defined CMDB, which is never there, but also align your services to business importance. And it's also important to place vulnerability management within the framework of the overall SOC. So it's simply one control that can help mitigate risk, through the SOC. And the visibility of these risks need to be fed to the monitoring and maybe your SOAR platforms that you have to ensure that the right level of focus and context is placed around the existence of high-risk vulnerabilities. You need to know the visibility of these high-risk vulnerabilities. And, you need to think how the SOC processes then work together to inform each other, as opposed to being standalone. So, guys, I think just to summarize the whole thing is to, you need to roll up your sleeves to ensure that you can have the visibility into the vulnerabilities that matter most. This would, and you can get this by enabling your SOC to provide a threat-centric approach to solving an issue that's still lingering. And on that note, I wanted to kind of just ask you if there's any other questions, please post them in the chat, and Sean and myself can sort of look at them. And Sean, one of the questions, one of the questions we had from our attendees was, sometimes cybersecurity seems to be perceived as a menace to their work role. Okay, so they seem to find security as a hindrance to move
Yeah.
things forward. And what are
Doctor
your
No.
thoughts? Dr. No, indeed.
Yeah.
So how do you think we can facilitate a relationship with IT? I mean, some of the things
Yeah.
you talked about, like, talking in an IT context for IT so that they understand what it is. It's not only about vulnerabilities and risk, it's about security controls.
Yeah.
What can we do with the firewall to block a port, etc. What else do you think we can add to this?
Yeah. So we've seen that in a lot of organizations that security or risk is seen as the department of no, right? And that really needs to change. It needs to change from a lot of different perspectives. Really, we need to understand that when you do business without security, you're just hurting yourself, right? Because at the end of the day, that cloud environment that you stood up, it's going to get taken down. It's going to get exploited. Data leakage will happen. The application's going to go offline. So we need to really change the perception that security isn't about saying no. It's about enabling business to do the job of business, but to do it safely. And if we do that correctly, then we end up being a positive for the organization, right? It's not just, I want to do this and security's telling me no, but it's we're all on the same page together, understanding that we need to do it. We need to do it safely. And when we do that, the application stays up, everything runs, the platform is good, and we don't get all the problems associated with an exploit. So that's how we shift from being the department of no to the department of enabling business.
Okay.
There's another question on there about how much is security today about protecting the perimeter, or do we give up all hope of controlling the perimeter and instead try to isolate critical assets, networks, and quickly identify and remediate attacks, assuming bad actors will penetrate the perimeter? And this is another great question that we hear all the time. I think of this in terms of a diet, right? And it's funny because human nature is one that we really like extremes, right? I'm going to go on a diet. I'm going to give up all sugar and all flour, and I'm just going to eat grass and nothing that casts a shadow for the next 9 months or something, right? So we get these really extreme ideas in our head, but like anything, it's all about balance, right? And this is one of the problems that we've seen over the last couple of years is, analysts have come out and said, oh, you just have to assume the bad guys are in, focus on the SOC. But when we do that, we give up all hope on the perimeter. We put too much work on the SOC and they can't keep up, right? They can't keep up with all of the incidents and stuff. So like any good plan, it's about balance, right? We need to put some effort into prevention. The perimeter is ugly these days, right? It's we don't have that nice little candy coating shell around the soft gooey center anymore. Our perimeter is porous. It's work from home and clouds and OT and all this kind of stuff. So we do need to redefine what that perimeter is and move away from a paradigm that says, here's my candy coated outside and I don't need to do anything internally. We need to get more blended, right? We need to have network segmentation projects. We do need to assume that the bad guys are going to get in and make sure that when they get in, they're limited with how much bad that they can do. But we can't just give up on prevention, right? We need to balance those two things out.
Yeah, agree, Sean. And to add to that, CyberProof as a SOC, we're seeing this every day, and the same question comes up again and again, and the new working from home has sort of given a difference to that attack surface that can penetrate the organization, and it's the implementation of things like EDR, for example, your endpoint detection and response, amalgamates your vulnerability management requirements as well, and it's like pulling that data together using these other new security controls that's born out of these scenarios that we have is something that is sort of blurring the perimeter definition completely. So I totally agree with you, Sean, and we're seeing this as a very a recurring theme across a lot of our customers already. There's another question there as well, and it seems to be a cheeky question, but is there a way that you can reduce the risk of identification intrusion to almost zero? And what do you think is the hardest attack pattern for identification compromise?
So I took the last two. I'm going to punt this one over to you.
That's a good one. So like you said, right, there's no magic silver bullet to do everything. So I think yeah, absolutely, the uh, identification intrusion to zero, you probably have seen the new zero trust models that are coming out from people, and you kind of have the capability to reduce the risk scenarios, but obviously there's no 100% way to reduce it to zero, and I would find it very uh, well, you could just disconnect from everything in the world and use your PC, and that would be zero. But that's kind of the thing. And the attack patterns. We have a dedicated threat intelligence team that looks at these different scenarios, and what we see is the attack patterns that threat actors are currently using seems to be changing with the different exploits available. So we see, for example, ransomware that has been around for 2 years that are still being exploited. So there's a very easy attack pattern that's still there. But we're also seeing, like Sean, you said, it's all about the money. They're going to find different ways to get in, and we see a lot of new attack patterns coming into the market as well. So it's a constant way of learning, and it must be an attacker's dream and fantasy to use a vulnerability that you don't know about. So it's definitely out there and definitely being used. Well, what are your thoughts, Sean?
No, I think you got it. Zero is a hard number always to get. We just need to understand what the risk is, be able to reduce it where we can, and understand the risk that we're accepting. That's usually what we see the boards asking for is, they understand that zero isn't possible, but they just want to understand, what risk am I accepting, and how can I buy that down? If I'm spending 5 million on security today, if I spend 2 million more, how's that going to move the needle? Is that a good investment or is it a bad investment?
Yeah.
So, it all comes down to comparing that risk and the money.
Cool. Thanks. And I have another question that I got, and it's more about somebody asking me about can you comment on the relationship between vulnerability prioritization that we discussed and sort of SLAs that are part of customer agreements. And I just want to give my perspective from CyberProof as a SOC that deals with vulnerability prioritization. We sort of ensure that our SLAs are sort of mapped to your business requirements, because it's sometimes it also depends on the criticality of the asset, for example. So we perform high level of grouping of your assets to ensure that we can match the SLAs that we provide as a managed service to your vulnerability prioritization as a service. And another question I have is, this is an easy one. This year we're experiencing greater work from home, and how should we adapting our security practices to match the new reality? And like I mentioned, it's securing that endpoint could be one of the things, looking at that EDR to provide you that holistic view on the endpoint, but also provide the remediation. Sean, any other thoughts on working from home and what we need to focus on?
Not on working from home, but I'll go to the question before that on the SLA.
Sure.
One of the challenges we've seen on that is, we're talking about kind of moving from this paradigm where we're just looking at the severity of a vulnerability into understanding what vulnerabilities are imposing the greatest amount of risk. One of the challenges that we've seen on that is when the SLAs were written, they were typically written around just the severity of the vulnerability. So maybe there's an SLA that says we're going to remediate all critical vulnerabilities within 30 days. But then as you morph your vulnerability management program to be risk focused, we understand that it might not be a critical severity vulnerability that's imposing the greatest amount of risk. So we see that it's really important to make sure that the SLA language changes as the vulnerability management program changes, right? We need to make sure that the SLAs are enforcing the behavior that we want to see in vulnerability management and remediation, right? We don't want a conflict there. We don't want the remediation team going, okay, I'm being measured on remediating critical vulnerabilities, but I'm being told to remediate high-risk vulnerabilities, right? We need to make sure that conflict doesn't exist and there's cohesion there.
Cool. Thanks, Sean. Sean, thank you very much for joining us today and giving us your insights. Very useful. We've also had a feedback in the polling that we've left. So if you've enjoyed the session, please do leave some feedback on the visibility into vulnerabilities. And it was all great to talk to you guys, and see you in the next session.
Thanks.